Connie Frazier. Connie spent the entire first season terrorizing kids who were just trying to find their missing friend. She ordered the murder of Benny Hammond, a kind man whose only crime was feeding a hungry child. She hunted Eleven like an animal, treating her as government property rather than a human being. When Joyce and Hopper discovered the lab's secrets, Connie was there to silence them, but karma finally caught up with her during the season finale. When the group was trapped at Hawkins Middle School, surrounded by government agents and a Demogorgon, Eleven had reached her breaking point. As Connie and her team closed in, ready to eliminate everyone, Eleven unleashed her full power. She crushed Connie's brain with her telekinetic abilities, killing her instantly during their desperate escape. This death felt like pure justice rather than tragedy. Her death was painful, but the deaths only get more brutal from here. Jason Carver. Jason was a leader in Hawkins' panic, and his obsession with satanic influence led to one of the most insane deaths. As captain of the basketball team and boyfriend to the murdered Chrissy Cunningham, Jason had everything going for him until his world was shattered by supernatural forces. Rather than accepting that something beyond his comprehension was happening, Jason latched onto the easiest explanation available in 1980s small-town America: satanic panic. He became convinced that Dungeons & Dragons' heavy metal music and the Hellfire Club were somehow responsible for the gruesome murders plaguing Hawkins. Jason turned his grief into a crusade, rallying the town into a witch hunt against Eddie Munson and anyone associated with the cult. His investigation led him to the Creel House, where he confronted Lucas about his supposed involvement with Satan and the supernatural murders. Jason was so blinded by his need for a simple explanation that he couldn't see the real danger around him. While he ranted about devils and demons, actual interdimensional monsters were preparing to invade his world. In the finale, after Lucas won his fight against Jason, the upside-down gate suddenly began expanding. The portal tore through everything, and Jason was caught directly in its path. He was literally ripped in half by the growing rift between dimensions in one of the show's most disgusting and painful moments. The irony was perfect and terrible, but his end is nothing compared to the innocent people who die next. Agent Harmon. Agent Harmon was a loyal protector to the boys at the Byers house. Unlike the corrupt agents of Hawkins' lab, Harmon was genuinely trying to do his job and keep people safe. He was assigned to guard the Byers family during their time in California. Harmon took his duty seriously, establishing a professional but caring relationship with Joyce, Jonathan, Will, and Mike. But safety was an illusion. When a mysterious federal assault team attacked the Byers' home with military precision, Harmon found himself outgunned and outnumbered. The attack was swift and brutal, designed to eliminate witnesses rather than capture them. Harmon fought back with everything he had, using his skill to buy the kids precious time to escape, which they did. He died defending Mike, Will, and Jonathan, taking multiple gunshot wounds as he held off the assault team. His sacrifice allowed the boys to flee and eventually reunite with Eleven, but it came at the ultimate cost. His heroic sacrifice hurt and left him with a slow, painful death, but the next deaths are so much worse. Grigory. Grigory was built like a tank and fought like a machine. He pursued Hopper and Joyce everywhere they went, shrugging off injuries that would probably kill normal people and displaying combat skills that bordered on superhuman. He was the Terminator in human form. Throughout their cat-and-mouse game, Grigory proved nearly impossible to kill. He survived every attack. Every time Hopper thought he'd gained the upper hand, the Russian would get back up and continue his relentless pursuit. But during the Starcourt Mall battle, Hopper finally got his chance for revenge. In a climactic fight scene, Hopper managed to gain the upper hand. With poetic justice, he shoved Grigory into the giant machine's gears, giving him a bloody and mechanical death that perfectly matched his inhuman nature. His over-the-top villainy made his death satisfying rather than tragic, but that doesn't stop it from being one of the most painful deaths in the show. That brutal revenge for Alexei felt good to watch, but the next deaths start hitting different. Heather Holloway. Heather was a bubbly lifeguard whose corruption signaled that the Mind Flayer was escalating its horror in Hawkins, targeting innocent teenagers and turning them into weapons against their own community. Heather's world seemed perfect on the surface. She had a job she enjoyed, friends who cared about her, and the simple pleasures of teenage life in the 1980s. But the Mind Flayer had evolved its strategy. Instead of simply killing its victims, the creature began possessing them, using their bodies as hosts while slowly consuming their consciousness. Heather became one of the first targets of this new approach, attacked while she was alone and vulnerable. Heather's personality slowly disappeared as the Mind Flayer took control, replacing replacing her warmth and humanity with cold calculation. She began luring other victims with Billy to the creature, including her own parents, using her familiar face and trusted relationships as weapons against the people who loved her. Heather's transformation from innocent side character to symbol of invasion was genuinely chilling. This corruption was disturbing, but it's about to get so much more personal. Fred Benson. As a member of the school newspaper, Fred was eager to prove himself as a serious journalist, always looking for the big story that would make his career. When supernatural murders began plaguing Hawkins again, Fred saw an opportunity. He convinced Nancy to let him tag along on her investigation, believing that documenting these events could be his ticket to journalistic success. Fred was ambitious, but he was also hiding a dark secret that made him the perfect target for Vecna. Earlier, Fred had been involved in a fatal car accident. He was driving when his vehicle struck and killed another person, a tragedy that haunted him every single day. The guilt was eating him alive, but he'd never told anyone about his role in the accident. He carried this burden alone, letting it destroy his thoughts and dreams. Vecna sensed this guilt in him. The entity began tormenting Fred with visions, forcing him to relive the car crash over and over again in increasingly disturbing ways. Fred found himself trapped in waking nightmares where the accident played out in horrifying detail, each time more traumatic than the last. The psychological torture escalated until Fred could no longer distinguish between reality and Vecna's visions. In his final moments, he was completely alone with his guilt and terror, experiencing the car crash in an endless loop while Vecna prepared to claim his life. When the entity finally killed him, Fred's body was left contorted and broken. Fred's death introduced the show's shift towards psychological horror and proved that Vecna was unlike any threat Hawkins had faced. The way he was tortured mentally before being killed was genuinely disturbing. Fred's psychological torture was brutal, but we're entering truly heartbreaking territory now. Before we get to the most devastating death, make sure you're subscribed because these breakdowns are about to get emotional. Benny Hammond. Benny embodied the best of small-town America. He was generous with food for those who couldn't pay, patient with difficult customers, and always ready with a kind word or a listening ear. When Eleven escaped from Hawkins' lab, she was scared, hungry, and alone. She wandered into Benny's restaurant in the middle of the night, and instead of calling the police or turning her away, Benny's first instinct was to help. Benny fed Eleven, gave her a warm place to rest, and tried to figure out how to help her safely. He had no idea about the supernatural experiments or government conspiracies surrounding this strange girl. All he knew was that a child needed help, and helping was the right thing to do. His compassion was immediately punished when government agent Connie Frazier arrived. Without hesitation or explanation, she shot Benny in cold blood, then staged his death to look like suicide. The man who had spent his life feeding and caring for others died because he tried to protect a scared little girl. Benny's murder established that Stranger Things wouldn't shy away from brutal consequences for good people. His death warned audiences that kindness could be deadly in Hawkins, where doing the right thing often leads to tragedy. The series was just warming up the emotional torture. Chrissy Cunningham. On the surface, Chrissy seemed to have everything a teenage girl could want. She was head cheerleader dating the basketball captain and admired by everyone at Hawkins High. But beneath her perfect exterior, Chrissy was struggling with demons that no one could see. She suffered from an eating disorder fueled by her mother's constant criticism and impossible expectations. Her home life was a nightmare of emotional abuse disguised as parental concern, where every meal became a battleground, and every mirror reflected her mother's disappointment. The pressure was crushing her slowly, day by day, until she could barely function. Chrissy began experiencing disturbing visions that she couldn't explain, seeing grotesque versions of her mother, and reliving traumatic memories in vivid, terrifying detail. Desperate for relief, she sought out Eddie Munson, hoping to buy drugs that might quiet the voices in her head. What Chrissy didn't know was that her trauma had marked her as a target for Vecna, an entity that fed on guilt, pain, and psychological suffering. The visions weren't random hallucinations. They were carefully crafted psychological torture designed to weaken her mental defenses and prepare her for consumption. At Eddie's trailer, while trying to complete the drug deal that she hoped would save her sanity, Vecna struck. Chrissy was pulled into a trance-like state where her worst fears became reality. Her body began contorting in impossible ways as Vecna's power took hold, bones breaking and joints twisting until she was barely recognizable as human. Chrissy's death was so violent and disturbing. Her murder instantly established Vecna as the most visceral threat the show had ever featured, capable of killing in ways that defied comprehension. But the emotional devastation is about to skyrocket. Barb Holland. Barb was the forgotten best friend whose disappearance became one of the series' most notorious injustices, representing every loyal friend who gets left behind when their bestie discovers boys and popularity. While Nancy was transforming herself to win Steve Harrington's attention, Barb remained steadfast in her friendship and values. She was the voice of reason who warned Nancy about the dangers of losing herself in pursuit of popularity. Barb saw through Steve's charm and recognized that Nancy was changing in ways that might not be healthy. But teenage social dynamics are cruel, and loyalty doesn't always win against the allure of acceptance. When Steve invited Nancy to his party, Barb came along reluctantly, knowing she didn't belong in that world, but unwilling to abandon her best friend. She sat by the pool feeling awkward and out of place while Nancy got drunk and flirted with Steve. The beer can that cut Barb's hand seemed like a minor annoyance, just another reminder that she didn't fit in with this crowd. But the blood in the water attracted something far worse than social embarrassment. The Demogorgon sensed the blood from the Upside Down and pulled Barb into the alternate dimension, where she was killed quickly and efficiently. The worst part was that nobody even realized she was missing for days. Nancy was too caught up in her new relationship to notice her best friend's absence, and the adults assumed Barb had simply gone home. When her car was found, people assumed she'd run away rather than face some teenage drama. Barb's death was painful because of her genuine loyalty and how easily she was forgotten. Her awkward sincerity made her disappearance especially heartbreaking, and it sparked the viral hashtag Justice for Barb movement among fans who recognized themselves in her story. But we're approaching the deaths that destroyed us all. Billy Hargrove. Billy was an abusive stepbrother whose final sacrifice became unforgettable in a moment of pure redemption. Throughout the series, Billy was established as one of the most genuinely threatening human antagonists, a racist bully whose anger seemed to have no limits. Billy's rage came from his own childhood trauma. His father was abusive and controlling, using violence and intimidation to shape Billy into his twisted image of masculinity. Billy learned that power came from fear, that showing weakness invited pain, and that the only way to avoid being a victim was to become a predator. This cycle of abuse manifested in Billy's treatment of Max, his stepsister, whom he tormented with the same tactics his father used on him. He threatened the kids, displayed obvious racism toward Lucas, and seemed incapable of showing genuine human emotion beyond anger and contempt. But when the Mind Flayer possessed Billy in Season 3, we got glimpses of the person he might have been without the trauma. The creature used his memories against him, but those memories included moments of genuine love and happiness from his early childhood with his mother before she left. During the final battle at Starcourt Mall, something crazy happened. As the Mind Flayer prepared to kill Eleven, Billy was forced to watch, still partially conscious within his possessed body. Eleven appealed to his humanity, reminding him of his mother and the love he'd once known. In that moment, Billy broke free from the Mind Flayer's control through sheer force of will. He chose to protect Eleven, stepping between her and the creature despite knowing it would cost him his life. The Mind Flayer's tentacles pierced his body multiple times, but Billy held his ground until the creature stopped its attack. Billy died, finally showing the vulnerability and love that his trauma had buried for so long. His last words were an apology. His sacrifice permanently shaped Max's emotional journey and proved that redemption was possible even for those who seemed beyond saving. But somehow the final two deaths are even more heartbreaking. Bob Newby. Bob was the world's sweetest boyfriend who died a true hero, leaving fans and Joyce absolutely devastated in what remains one of the most unfairly tragic deaths in television history. Bob was everything Hopper wasn't. Where Hopper was gruff and damaged, Bob was soft and healing. He loved Joyce completely and unconditionally, accepting her trauma and her complicated family situation without judgment or reservation. Bob also formed a genuine connection with Will and Jonathan, never trying to replace their father but offering himself as a supportive presence in their lives. He encouraged Will's artistic talents, helped with homework, and brought a sense of normalcy to a family that had been through extraordinary pain. When the group became trapped at Hawkins' lab, surrounded by demodogs and with no way to escape, someone needed to restore power to the building. It was a suicide mission that required navigating monster-filled corridors alone, but Bob volunteered without hesitation. He understood the stakes and chose to risk everything to save the people he loved. Bob successfully completed his mission, using his knowledge of the building's layout and his natural problem-solving abilities to restore power and unlock the doors. He was running back to safety, just moments away from reuniting with Joyce when the demodogs caught him. Bob had succeeded in his mission and was so close to safety that you could taste the relief. Joyce was waiting for him, ready to embrace the man who had just saved everyone. But the demodogs brought him down just steps away from the exit, but somehow the next spot is even more devastating. Eddie Munson. After being wrongly accused of Chrissy's murder, Eddie spent Season 4 as a fugitive, hiding from both the law and an angry mob convinced he was a satanic killer. Eddie represented everything that small-town America feared in the 1980s. He played Dungeons and Dragons, listened to heavy metal, and refused to conform to social unreal expectations. In a different story, he might have been the villain, but Stranger Things revealed him to be one of the most genuinely good people in Hawkins. As the leader of the Hellfire Club, Eddie created a safe space for outcasts and misfits, giving kids like Dustin and Mike a place where they could be themselves without judgment. When the supernatural truth was revealed, Eddie could have run away and saved himself. Instead, he chose to help fight against Vecna. In the final battle, Eddie's job was simple: create a distraction to lure the Demobats away from the main attack, then escape through the portal to safety. He set up his guitar and amplifier in the Upside Down and began playing Master of Puppets, creating the most epic concert in television history. The plan worked perfectly. The Demobats swarmed toward the music, giving Nancy, Steve, and Robin the opening they needed to attack Vecna. Eddie should have run then. Should have escaped through the portal and lived to fight another day. But when he saw the Demobats starting to turn back toward his friends, he made a choice. Eddie cut the rope that led back to safety and grabbed his guitar again. He wasn't going to run anymore. He stood his ground and fought the Demobats with everything he had, using his guitar as both weapon and battle cry. Eddie died in Dustin's arms, finally proud that he didn't run away. His last words were about not being a coward, about finally standing up when it mattered most. But the tragedy didn't end with his death. The town continued to blame him for the murders, never learning about his heroism or sacrifice. Eddie's death is the most painful because he died a hero but was never recognized for it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the most painful deaths in Squid Game, click the video on the screen.